Hello and welcome to this object removal tutorial. This is based on a real use case, a job that I had a couple of years ago where I received this piece of footage shot as part of a music video for the Piano Guys, if you're familiar with that YouTube channel. Here we've got a long drone shot which was filmed in Jordan, where we are orbiting around the cellist and we're in this incredible ancient carved location. But there are a whole bunch of kind of distracting elements in the periphery here. We've got like this orange fence going on. We've got a bunch of shops probably selling souvenir tourist stuff. As we move closer, we can see, you know, some rugs on display here and like a bench. And if you zoom in really far, you can see our intrepid drone pilot. Anyway, lots of little distracting elements that they probably don't want us to see, or they don't want to distract us from the music from the cellist as part of this music video. So in 2016, when I was given this shot, I cleaned up, you know, this building here. This is the before, here's the after. As you can see, I cleaned up the building. There's a car over here. I did a not so great sky replacement. Luckily, this isn't a sky replacement tutorial. And you've got these elements on the side and the elements farther down, all gone. So it's all done using 2D planar tracking, a whole lot of individual planar tracks for a whole lot of individual planes. For this tutorial, I'm going to focus on a small segment, just this piece here, and I'm going to focus on one area in particular, this bench here. I'm focusing here partly because it's very easy to track and very clear to demonstrate. And then you just repeat the process for each individual object that you find in the scene. First, I'm going to analyze the footage, just see what's going on here. Camera is panning as it moves back. The benches have entered frame, and they just disappear into the distance. In the year since I originally touched this footage and fixed it for the Piano Guys, After Effects has created this wonderful effect called ContentAware Fill, which I've only recently begun experimenting with because it's a fairly recent addition. And with relatively little effort, you can come up with a pretty decent result for getting rid of those benches. And I whipped this up earlier just using a garbage 4-point mask that I tracked using After Effects. That tracks through here. And having After Effects itself generate a fill layer, I was able to get a pretty decent result that erases the benches. It leaves a few little artifacts, but that's my bad for the mask that I drew. That was just in a hurry because I was testing it. But as you can see, we've replaced the benches with a texture that's taken from the surrounding areas, and it looks all right. I would not be too mad about that result. But because I originally fixed this footage using Mocha, I'm going to stick with Mocha for the tutorial. But I did want to point out that ContentAware Fill is a viable option. Okay, back to our comp here that I'm going to use Mocha for. I'm going to identify, while we're here, a hero frame. A frame where the entire object that I want to replace is in frame, where the camera is close enough that I'll get plenty of detail from the surrounding area. And I think frame 45 is going to be our best friend here. I'm just going to use Control-8 to make a marker in the timeline. I want to remember this later. Now it's time for Mocha. There are a few ways to open Mocha. You can go to your effects tab here and just type Mocha AE, and that works. Or, obviously right-click, go to your effects, Boris FX Mocha. Or the traditional way, the way that the plugin used to work, go to animation, you have your footage selected, go to animation, track in Boris. And in the effects panel, we see here Mocha AE, and you can launch it just by clicking this icon. And here we go, we have the interface for Mocha. If you've never used Mocha before, a couple of important hotkeys that you need to know that will make your life a lot easier. You don't navigate the footage the same way that you do in After Effects. To zoom, you don't scrub, you don't use your scroll wheel, that just scrubs the footage back and forth. If you hold the Z key or the Z key if you're not American, click and drag with your mouse up and down to zoom, and then the X key is your grabber tool, as opposed to the H or the space bar, holding the space bar like you would in After Effects. What Mocha will do is track a surface. It detects a pattern, a two-dimensional surface within your footage, and it tracks that through space as opposed to individual contrast points. You have to create an area for Mocha to track, so we'll go to this X pen here and just click in the points. We have this wonderful flat surface in the sandstone here. I'm just going to click and then right click to finish creating your shape. I've just created a very simple border around this relatively flat plane, and this is the pattern that Mocha will be tracking through the footage. I'm going to enable the perspective option here. For some reason by default that's not enabled, but we do want to have perspective because our camera is moving through space. And then I'll hit the track forward button, wait for that to track, and keep an eye on the shape as it moves and see that it's sticking, which it seems to be doing very well. Okay, and I'll fast forward here to the end of the track. Marvelous. That seems to have tracked very nicely. And as we scrub through here, we can see that that shape is holding very nicely. Up here on the top, we have this blue S and this pink grid. Those can help visually to see that, yes, we are sticking to that plane quite well. I'm just going to disable those and go back to our keyframe, the green frame, and we will track the first half of the footage. Don't want to forget that. And as our area here starts to leave the frame, notice that it's still holding remarkably well because Mocha is grabbing onto the whole image, and even if there's just a little piece of it left, it can keep track of where the other pixels would be that have left the frame, and it does a very, very nice job of that. And at this point, the benches are out of the frame, so even if the track didn't work after this point, we would be okay. The track is ready. Things are sticking nicely. Now here is an incredibly important step that I forget half the time and have to go back and fix. So remember the blue S from before. If you click that, the corners of this blue rectangle correspond to the corner pin points in After Effects when we export this data. So we want to make sure that we line them up correctly. And we are on our hero frame, which is frame 45. And this button here, the blue S with the corners going out, that is our best friend. If we click that, it goes ahead and aligns the corner pin data to our frame 45. Imagine this is a pane of glass in front of the camera, sort of like an old matte painting in the 50s or something, where they actually painted physically on glass and filmed through the glass onto a landscape. Except now we're moving through space, but the glass is moving perfectly to stay lined up with the camera. And what we're going to do is we're going to paint a little patch that will stick over the bench, and that patch, just the patch, will float in front of the camera and obscure those benches as we move through the shot. So now we want to save right here in the top left under File, and I'm going to, make sure to name your layers, kids. Bench track. Go ahead and save that again. Exit Mocha. In the Mocha dialog here, we have this tracking data. We will create data based on our bench track. Make sure that the gear is enabled. Now, at the bottom, we have our export option. I select corner pin that supports motion blur. That way, if there's fast camera movement, your patch or your matte painting, so to speak, will have the corresponding motion blur to go along with the camera movement. That's very handy in certain instances, not so much in this shot. And then we need to choose a layer to export to. If I were to apply the data to the layer itself, well, that certainly doesn't work. It looks fun, but it's not what we're looking for, so I'm just going to undo that. We need to create a new layer, and there are a couple of ways to do this. One easy way to do it would be to duplicate our footage, pre-compose it. I'm going to call this bench track. And if we go back to our sky replacement comp, go back to the base layer, and we will choose to export to the bench track layer and apply. Now we have the same problem that we had before. Because we have this video playing on top of the other video, you can kind of see that we've got a little frame on top of a big frame. That's still not what we want. And let's go into our bench track. Remember, frame number 45. We're going to right-click, time, freeze frame. So now it's just like a still photo. And if we go back to our main comp, it's a little hard to tell what's going on, but there are some weird artifacts going on here. If we toggle the visibility, notice that the plane that we tracked is locked on. And that stays true through all the camera movement and everything. The other three-dimensional objects that are sticking out, obviously they are not on the same plane, so they will have changed as the camera moves through space. But that plane remains the same. And now I'm going to go back to 45. We can zoom in here. Now what we want to do in our pre-comp is create the patch we were talking about, paint out these benches. So for that, we will select our layer, go to Layer, Open Layer, so it opens in a layer window as opposed to a composition window, because within a layer window, we can use paint tools. We've got a clone stamp here, and I'm going to go ahead and just do kind of a rough paint job here. When painting, when you've got several frames in the composition, you want to make sure that your duration in the paint panel here is set to constant. If it is set to single frame, if I make a stroke, option to select an area, and I start making a stroke here, you'll see that in the composition, if we open up effects, you see the little frame here, just a single frame. As soon as we advance by a frame, the patch disappears. That does us no good. We can, after the fact, if you forget and do single frame, after the fact you can select your strokes and extend them to the full duration of your comp, but to save yourself the hassle, just set this to constant frame. Okay, make sure you have your time indicator set to the beginning, and I'm just going to do this kind of quick and dirty. There is a lot of sandstone in this frame, so we can fill in this area without too much trouble. There is a little bit of a seam where floor meets wall, so I'm gonna steal from this side over here. Hold down Option to select, and then line that up roughly. And I'm just going to paint. And I'm not going to worry too much about getting it perfectly, but this, you get the idea. This isn't so much a painting tutorial. You want to take care to make sure that things match up and look nice. But you know what? That works. Now we can go ahead and close this layer panel. If we go back to our main comp, and let's zoom out here a little bit, we see that we still just have this still frame with four corners that's pasted on top of our main frame. So let us go back to our hero frame, 45, select our bench layer, and let's draw a simple mask around where the benches are, and we will very soon see if we've made a mistake here. Okay, now the bench is sticking out the side, so we can pull our mask. And we've got this little equipment cart thing behind us that's a little bit annoying, but we won't worry too much about that. F to feather the mask a little bit, just a few pixels. Okay, so now if we isolate this layer, you can see that we just have the patch. And if we play through the comp, you'll see that the patch is floating through space, and it is matching. You may wonder why I pre-comped this layer instead of just freezing the frame here and doing the paint work inside my main comp. The problem is, if I were to do that, the paint tool does not play nicely with masks. Don't ask me why, but as soon as I make a mask, all my paint strokes get messed up. So to avoid that, I do the mask on in a separate composition from the paint work. I have to pre-compose all the paint work I do. That's why I take the time to pre-compose. Now earlier I mentioned the ContentAware Fill tool with After Effects, which can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you of essentially creating the patch for your frame. It also happens to have a very handy tool for this process that lets me bypass this whole pre-comp step by creating a reference frame. If I click to create a reference frame, After Effects will create a Photoshop document that will be stored nicely within my After Effects project folder. It launches me directly into Photoshop, where I can use Photoshop's tools to paint out the object that I don't like. I'm going to play with the Heal brush, which is one of my favorite tools in Photoshop, and just let Photoshop do the work for me. And if I'm happy with that, maybe I'll touch it up a little bit here and there. It's not perfect, but I'm going to just, for the sake of demonstration, go with that. If I save the Photoshop document, go back to After Effects, and this reference frame has been dropped into my timeline already. Now this is used by ContentAware in specific ways, but we can repurpose it for our own uses. I'm going to move it up in the stack. I'm going to go to Time and enable time remapping so I can extend it to the beginning and the end of my comp here. Make sure that we disable the pre-comp that we did earlier so we're not seeing that. And yeah, the bench is all cleaned out. And I'm going to go ahead and apply our Mocha data, the corner pin data, to the reference frame. And that is going to look very much like the pre-comp was looking before, where we've got that still frame that's floating over the original footage. And we simply need to draw a mask around the Photoshop layer. Make sure I've got the Photoshop layer selected. A reference frame. And if I draw a mask around that, now that layer is our little floating patch, which we can isolate and view this way. And you'll see that the mask, when you move away from frame 45, the mask itself, the way it's represented on here, doesn't line up with the actual patch. But the patch is lined up with the track, as we can see. And I've obviously done these processes rather quickly in the tutorial setting. You want to take your time to make sure things look nice. But it is helpful to remember that within the context of the music video, the final product, or the movie, or whatever it is that you're working on, the viewer should have a very obvious place where the filmmaker is directing their attention. If your attention is sufficiently captured by the filmmaker, you could have crazy things going on in the periphery and you wouldn't even notice. I mean, there are movies out there like Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. There's a shot in that movie where there's a camera guy. The B camera operator is in full view of the camera, but I never noticed it until somebody, who had analyzed the film frame by frame posted a photo online. And we do live in a time where people are analyzing things frame by frame, but when they're actually watching the video, this is a music video. People are watching it on their phones. People are watching this video because they like the musicians. They're not here to pick apart the visual effects. Nobody has ever commented that, oh, I think there were objects in the background that you guys are hiding. The great thing about doing effects like this is that I'm not creating the featured hero asset. I'm not animating a dinosaur in 3D. No, I'm just cleaning up the things on the wall so they don't distract you from the featured element, which is a musician in this case. Clean things up with planar tracking and Mocha. I'm sure there are easier, better ways to do this, especially if you involve 3D software. But this is a method that's worked for me, and it can work well for you in the right situation.